and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. This is Irreverent, Faith and Current Affairs.
Welcome everybody to this special episode of Irreverent Faith and Current Affairs with me, Jamie Franklin. I'm very happy to be joined today by Fr Richard Bastable. Fr Richard is a vicar in West London, and he is the principal author of an open letter on assisted suicide from clergy. It's a letter which has been doing the rounds for a while now, and I think as of the latest count, there are something like 980 members of clergy in the Church of England who have signed this letter, including several bishops, deans, and people of this sort. So it's had massive uptake, massive success in that sense so far. And we're going to talk to Fr Richard about it today. So Fr Richard, thank you very much for being with us today.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Jamie. Thank you for the invitation.
Excellent. Well, it's great to talk to you, and it's brilliant work that you're doing with this letter. Fr Richard, could you just tell us just a little bit about yourself, who you are, and your principal concerns around this issue of assisted suicide, and what circumstances led to the writing of this letter?
Of course, yeah, thank you. As Father Jamie's already said, I'm based in West London. I run two parishes here near Shepherd's Bush. I've been here for nearly 12 years now, and I've served all my ministry to date in the Diocese of London. I've been ordained for, I think, 16 years now. This letter really came out of a concern. I preached about it in a homily at a low mass midweek when it was first sort of floated that a private member's bill on assisted suicide would be coming forward in Parliament, and I just referred to it in a homily, and it sparked conversation amongst the small midweek congregation that were there on that particular day. And then as things built up towards the first reading of the bill, I decided to try and articulate my concerns a bit more directly. So I drafted a letter. The original intention would be that it would be a letter sent to a newspaper within a few days, with a handful of signatories, perhaps 20 or so, of people probably from amongst my known contacts who I thought would agree with me and with whom I would share it to see if they would sign. It developed, snowballed, and became something much bigger than that.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to help people to understand, I mean, particularly people who might be watching this who don't live in the UK, can you give us a little bit of context around the letter? So this private member's bill has been introduced by a Labour MP called Kim Ledbetter. So what's the bill, and what stage is it at now, and why do you oppose it personally?
Yeah, good questions. And I must say I'm no parliamentary expert, so this will be as per my understanding rather than with any great authority on the issue. But there are several routes by which legislation can come forward to Parliament. The ordinary route that we'd expect most often is that the government itself would propose a bill, and a government bill would usually be whipped by the government and by the opposition. A government can only be a government if it holds a majority on the whole, and so those sorts of bills tend to pass through government, albeit with some amendments perhaps. This is a different type of route. So this is a private member's bill, so it doesn't come doesn't necessarily come with the approval or backing of the government as such. And because this is understood to be an ethical issue, this bill also isn't whipped. That means that parties don't instruct their members how to vote. Individual MPs can make a free choice on how they vote, depending to their own opinions and conscience on the matter. A private member's bill comes into Parliament for the first reading, which, as I understand it, is something of a bit of a formality. There's not usually a debate around the first reading, just the bill is introduced and then proceeds a few weeks later to the second reading, which is the stage that this bill will be at on Friday the 29th of November. At the second reading, there is opportunity for debate and for a vote. as I've already alluded to, individual MPs can vote as they wish. There's no party whip, there's no line on this, including the government not having any line on it. So, indeed, individual cabinet members can vote as they wish. Usually, with other types of legislation, we'd expect all the cabinet to vote one way or the other. And if a cabinet member disobeys the whip, they usually get the sack from cabinet. But this will be very different with, we've already heard different cabinet members declare their intention to vote one way or the other. So that's a bit about the process. And I think the second part of your question, Father Jamie, was about why I oppose the bill. I think there were several reasons why I oppose the bill, and I have been challenged by this by some people on X, formerly known as Twitter. I do have a fundamental moral objection to the bill, which is based on my understanding of the Christian faith, of theology, and of ethics, and that is that the taking of human life is not permitted. We see that very clearly outlined in the Ten Commandments. So I do have a fundamental theological and moral objection to this bill. It doesn't stop there, though. I think there are, for me, further ethical considerations around this bill. I think, as we've seen in other parts of the world where legislation to allow assisted suicide, assisted dying, whatever particular label you want to call it, in other parts of the world where we've seen legislation introduced, that legislation always has widened. The legislation being considered at the moment, we're being told, is really only for those who have 6 months or less to live. That's very hard to judge, for one thing, but also where legislation has been introduced in other places, that has widened to people with perhaps more than 6 months to live, or people with non-terminal conditions. So we see that these safeguards aren't perhaps as safe as might be claimed. I think there are other issues with the legislation around who it will impact on the greatest. So it's one thing for, and I don't like to make the argument too personal, but it's one thing perhaps for comfortably off celebrities with terminal conditions to make an argument around this. But actually, when we introduce legislation like this, when we introduce the possibility of assisted suicide, is it only going to be comfortably off people who make this choice very freely? Or is this going to impact people who actually don't have access for multiple reasons to good palliative care, good health care, perhaps to family relationships and support networks around them, people who feel isolated in their old age or in their sickness or in their painful condition? Is it them who are going to end up feeling, if not social pressure, perhaps even personal pressure to take an option which they might not otherwise consider taking? I think it's also very powerful that there are, to my knowledge, no disability groups and no palliative care groups who say that assisted suicide or assisted dying legislation is a good thing. To my knowledge, all UK-based disability groups and all UK-based palliative care groups say actually we should resist any approach to assisted suicide or assisted dying.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that. I mean, just on the thing about there being a fundamental moral objection to it, this seems to me to be one of the principal incoherences about this whole conversation, particularly around this issue of safeguards. Because essentially what's being said to us is that, by the people who are advocating for this, is that assisted suicide is in certain circumstances a good thing. It's a moral good. Now, it's very hard to sustain the view, in my opinion, that assisted suicide is, at least in some circumstances, a moral good, but beyond a certain threshold and set of criteria, it then becomes, for some inexplicable reason, a moral evil. So in this case, we're told, that threshold is a 6-month diagnosis of terminal illness. Now, it's absolutely inevitable, in my view, that if this passes, then the logic that is applied to people who have 6 months to live, approximately, will be applied to people who have more time to live. And as you say, to people who have something other than terminal conditions, for the reason that the passing of this legislation would amount to, it would be tantamount to the moral approval of assisted suicide. That's the way it works. And it's related to this issue of the slippery slope, or whatever you want to call it. This isn't an arbitrary argument. It's not to say, oh, it just leads to bad things. It's that implicit in the moral judgments of the legislation that's implied by the legislation is its application to a broader and broader group of people. And it's interesting in your letter that you say you actually mention the US state of Oregon. And this was interesting to me when I read your letter, and I signed it as well, because this was precisely, in my recollection, what Kim Ledbetter, the Labour MP who brought this bill forward, cited as an example of where this can work. And as far as I have heard, and I've seen a bit about this, Oregon is the one case that has been brought up as an example of how this can actually work. But in the letter, you yourself say that even Oregon hasn't worked, and it's been applied to a broader group of people. So, I mean, could you speak to any of that, particularly to that example of Oregon, but also to these broader examples of places, Canada, Belgium, and so on, where there are increasingly broad group of people who are eligible for assisted suicide, and something about what that looks like?
Thank you. I think one of the fundamental things I'd want to say in response to what you've just said is, saying that something which is morally reprehensible, taking of human life, is morally permissible because there's this line which is drawn, which in the case we're being asked to consider currently is 6 months left to live. What's that saying? I would want to ask, what's that saying about human life? Are the last 6 months of somebody's life less worth living than what has gone before? Whose decision is that? Why is it 6 months? Why not less time? Why not 3 months? Or why not more time? Why not 12 months or 24 months? I'm sure we all know from our own experience with family members that terminal illnesses can be very abrupt and very shocking, or they can be very long and drawn out. And this 6 month line is rather arbitrary and imposes some sort of value on what is perceived to be the last 6 months of a person's life. That's the first thing I think I'd want to say to that and to question about it. And I think what we've seen in Oregon, as in other places, is that the argument widens once you say that it's only for people with a terminal diagnosis and 6 months to live. Well, why not for other people then? I'm no legal expert, but there are all sorts of articles published recently talking about how this current legislation could be challenged in the courts about not only extending that 6 month period to perhaps longer prognoses, but also saying, well, why just these limited conditions? Why not more conditions? Or why not just because I want it? Or why not because I'm disabled, or because I have other conditions which I feel limit my life expectancy, so not life expectancy as such necessarily, my kind of enjoyment of life, my reasons for wanting to live. And I think some of that is framed in arguments of personal choice. A lot of the arguments around personal choice, freedom to decide, freedom for a person to choose where their own markers in terms of their human dignity. I have a lot of sympathy, of course, I'm sure we all do, especially those of us who are Christian ministers and are often at the bedsides of people who are sick, people who are dying. I have a lot of sympathy with people who suffer tremendous pain, and a lot of sympathy for their family members and friends and loved ones who have to witness them going through that terrible ordeal. But what I would say also is a person's right to choose is only their sovereign right up until the point at which that choice could begin to have a negative effect on others. It's a bit of a weak example, but it's illustrative, I think. If I'm a very good driver, which I'm not, by the way, but if I were a very good driver, is it okay for me to say, well, I know there's a 30-mile-per-hour limit here, but I'm a good driver at 50 miles per hour. I believe that everyone else will be safe if it's me driving at 50 miles per hour. No, that's not okay. That's not how the laws of society work. The laws of society are there to help to protect those who are most vulnerable, those who are most at risk. And so to say, I want this freedom of choice, I want to maintain my human dignity, I want to be able to decide at the moment at which I will die, might seem like a reasonable position for somebody in very great pain towards the end of their life to be making for themselves. But we see that always widens, and that always has a greater impact on those who are already in the most vulnerable position in our society.
So that is, it relates to something I was going to ask you. I know this letter is signed by Church of England clergy, but what would you say to somebody who says you are just bringing your perspective as a religious person or as a Christian person to this conversation, and you're actually imposing your religion upon other people? Would you advance that sort of argument in that case?
I would say three things to that. Actually, I would say yes, I am bringing a Christian perspective to this argument, and I have every right to do so, just as anybody from any other perspective has a right to an opinion and a right to express that opinion. So I would accept a part of that challenge.
Yep.
I would then say I believe that my faith has something constructive and positive to say, even to those who don't share my convictions, that there's room for opinion and debate and discussion, and I can come from my position and other people can come from their position, and that conversation can be constructive and instructive. And thirdly, I would say we can even set aside my opposition to this bill. To be specific, we could set aside my opposition to this bill from my faith perspective, because some of the arguments apply whether one is a person of faith or not. A few weeks ago, I sat down, I hadn't watched it before, I sat down and watched the documentary on this very subject made by Liz Carr, who's a disabled actress and comedian and TV presenter. That's called Better Off Dead, and it's available on BBC iPlayer. And she makes it very clear that she comes at this from the perspective of an atheist, of somebody who doesn't have faith in God and so wouldn't share my convictions. But her arguments against it, nonetheless, overlap a lot, not entirely. The Venn diagram isn't a perfect overlap, but her arguments overlap a lot with some of the arguments that I would want to make as well. So I think the objection to somebody coming at it from a faith perspective, I'd want to say, faith is valid, we can still have a conversation, and not all the objections are entirely just faith-based and therefore dismissible.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great answer. What do you worry about if this bill passes? How would this change our society?
I think that's a really good question, because I think it fundamentally changes how we say we value human life as a society. And it says, I just used the title of that documentary, and it says that we as a society think that some people are better off dead. And I don't believe that's something we say as a society as present, and I don't believe it is something we should be saying as a society.
And both in your letter and in just your personal opinion now, what is the alternative to that direction? What constructive vision do you suggest as something alternative to assisted suicide?
I think it's really important that there's a thorough review of palliative care provision in this country. We're told that we have, in terms of relative to other countries, that we have actually quite good palliative care in this country. That may be the case. I don't have experience of palliative care in other countries. What I do know is that the palliative care system in this country, though it is full of excellent people working very hard and doing a fantastic job, is hugely underfunded and under-resourced. And that palliative care is a postcode lottery as well. That in affluent areas, you're more likely to be able to access good palliative care. In less affluent areas, you're less likely to be able to access good palliative care. That, of course, poses a question again about who would be accessing this assisted suicide provision. So I think proper funding and a proper review of palliative care is a good place to start. I also think there's a lot to be said for how we seek to support those other than the patient who are affected by terminal illness and conditions with chronic severe pain. What support is there for family, friends and loved ones who have to see somebody else dying in great pain? How do we support them? And I think finally, and I come at this particularly from the perspective of being a Christian priest and often preparing people for their death, often being with them when they die, and often, of course, being responsible for their funerals and for the bereavement care for their families. I think something about how we help people prepare to die well, and what thinking and work can be done on that as well.
Thank you. Let's just finish by just talking about the letter itself. So the letter has been signed by over 1,000. So I think it's limited to Church of England clergy, isn't it? So beneficiaries, people who have got a license, people who've got permission to officiate. As I said, I'm looking at it now. You've got many bishops, some of them senior diocesan bishops, including Bishop of Winchester, where I am. You've also got bishops in London and all across the country have signed this. It's an astonishing response, almost 1,000 clergy. I think one of the things that's most incredible about this response to the letter, but just more broadly as well, is the fact that you have liberals and traditionalists, a broad swathe of people who in the Church of England notoriously are at odds with each other. And the church is divided over so many issues, but over this issue, it seems like there's actually relative consensus on this, which is a wonderful thing to see. So, what is your hope for this letter? What's good? What would you like to see it achieve? And also for clergy who are eligible to sign it, who haven't yet signed it, what should they do in order to sign it?
Yeah, I think. I mean, this letter has been extraordinary and far exceeded and excelled my own expectations. And when it really started taking off, I was a bit overwhelmed. And let me just say that if I'd known it was going to go this way, I might have handled it a little differently. For instance, I might have set up a dedicated email address because my inbox is in chaos. I can imagine. But I want to say two things which I found particularly striking, which relate to the questions you've just asked. The first is the way in which it did take off beyond my expectations. And I thought, well, where is this coming from? All these people I don't know, and all these people don't usually agree with me or agree with each other, wanting to sign up to this. And I thought, I more than thought, I sort of felt in a very profound way that this had become a task which God had given me, and there was a sense that that this was not just some project I was kind of working on at my laptop now and again, but that hopefully this was going to do real good. And it was. I was in Walsingham at the weekend and saw Bishop Lindsay Irwin, who I haven't seen for some years, and I mentioned to him. He mentioned the letter to me, and I mentioned to him the point you've just made about these people from very diverse backgrounds within the Church of England, and people who famously would disagree with each other most of the time, signing up for this one thing. And he said that he's sure that's a sign that the Lord's hand is in it. So I hope this letter can can help to do a real good as we, as a country and as our parliament considers legislation, which I think could be very dangerous and very unsafe for some people who are already very vulnerable in our society. I hope this letter can do real good. And in terms of what it can do practically, because it's a free vote, as I mentioned at the beginning, because MPs can vote in accordance with their consciences, it also means, of course, that some MPs will be undecided, some MPs might be open to changing their mind. So that I hope this letter has an impact on the way this legislation goes. And I would encourage anyone who has signed this letter, when it's released in about a week's time, to send a copy of it to their MP and say, I signed this letter, as did however many more it'll be by then, hopefully around 1,000 others. And this tells you why this issue is really important to me. Beyond that, I would encourage anybody at all listening to this podcast to write to their MP anyway. And there are lots of resources online you can find for doing this. A quick search for the internet will help you to find resources for that. And if there are people listening to this podcast who would be eligible to sign, that's clergy within the Church of England who haven't signed as yet and would like to. If you find me on X, formerly known as Twitter, at @rmbastable, and just give me a follow, send me a DM. If you're not able to send me a DM, just reply to one of my most recent tweets, and I'll make sure that's possible, and then we can be in touch and sort it out for you.
And I'll put Father Richard's the link to his Twitter on below this video or below the podcast, however you're accessing it. So you'll be able to click on that and find him on Twitter/X after you've listened to this. So we'll wrap things up there, Father. But is there anything else? Are there any last words or anything you feel like you haven't said that you'd like to say, just to finish off with?
There is one thing I think it's really important that we don't fail to say, and really important we all do, as well as argue over this issue, give our opinions over this issue, be active over this issue with writing letters, being in touch with people. I also think, which I haven't said so far, it's really important to engage with the debate. If you're active on social media, or if you have a platform for speaking, if you preach, or other platforms, or even just amongst your family and friends, to discuss this issue, to discuss it generously as well. Other people will have other opinions, and they'll have some good reasons for those other opinions. So to listen, but also to challenge and to question. But fundamentally, I think it's what's really important that we all commit to is to pray about this issue and to ask for God's help and guidance in the next week or so as this issue comes to the fore in our nation as it's presented once more to Parliament.
Thank you very much, Father Richard. Great to have you with us, and God bless and good luck with everything you're doing.
Thank you.